Well, church, good morning. My name is Mike, and I'm the site pastor for Grace Harborcreek. And I am excited to bring you the word today as we continue our sermon series, Courageous Choices. We spent the last 2 weeks looking at Joshua and the Israelites as they stood on the precipice of a new reality. Moses, their leader who led them out of Egypt and in the desert for 40 years, is dead. And before them now is this often talked about but previously unseen promised land which they were to conquer. And with this challenge came choices that needed to be made, choices that required courage. And so this morning we're going to talk about the walls of Jericho. And now you might be thinking, hey, didn't Mike preach a couple months ago about David and Goliath? You're correct. I've only been in my role as site pastor since January, so between you and me, it seems kind of interesting that the new guy is getting the classic Sunday school stories, but don't worry about that. Anyways, as we get ready to get into the story, I want to lead with a couple of questions. These are questions that I ask myself often, and I would bet many of you do as well. Isn't obeying God supposed to be easy? I mean, if God truly knows best, shouldn't obedience come easily? If obedience is hard, am I really doing it right? And by the way, these are totally fair questions, which I want us to keep in mind as we get going here. So let's get into it. So far in the book of Joshua, he has courageously taken command of the Israelites, and they miraculously crossed over the Jordan River. They were now in Canaan, the promised land. And after they celebrated the first Passover in this new land that was to be theirs, they now begin to turn their attention to its conquest. So read with me the first portion of our passage today, starting in Joshua chapter 5 verses 13. Now when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him, with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight before him." Did you notice an echo from a previous story in here? Maybe something about taking off sandals and being on holy ground? Remember, God also appeared to Moses before he began his mission way back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 5. Moses was told to do the same thing. Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And now obviously Joshua and Moses were very close. Moses was the leader and Joshua was the second in charge. They left Egypt, traveled all the way to Canaan, and then lived in the desert together for 40 years. You have to imagine that at some point, Moses and Joshua were lounging around outside their tent after a long day, and he told him the story about the burning bush at least once, but probably 100 or 1,000 times. How encouraging would this experience have been for Joshua? Something just like what happened to Moses, and just as he's about to lead the Israelites into their first armed conflict. And not just this experience, but the presence of the commander of the Lord's army. His presence implies that the Lord will fight for Joshua and Israel. Notice the words in verse 2. "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor." God was going to give Jericho to the Israelites. They weren't going to take it. I mean, they certainly weren't going to take it following these directions. I know a little bit about military strategy, and this was terrible tactics. You can't conquer a city by marching around it. But that wasn't the intent. This was to be a ceremonial act, not a military one. Joshua and the Israelites were to demonstrate obedience and let God take care of the outcome. So let's keep reading in verse 6. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Go forward, march around the city, and let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." And just as Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests, bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord, went forward, blowing the trumpets, with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priests, who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the ark, while the trumpets blew continually. But Joshua commanded the people, "You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about at once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests, bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns, before the ark of the Lord walked on, and they blew the trumpets continually. And the armed men were walking before them, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the second day they marched around the city once, and returned into the camp. So they did for 6 days. On the 7th day they rose early, at the dawn of the day, and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. Again, I think it's pretty intuitive. This is no way to take a city. Honestly, it sounds kind of crazy to me. Now, to be fair, it sounds less crazy if you've just seen God stop up a mighty river and you've just come face to face with the commander of the Lord's army. So, with clear instructions and a choice to be made, what does Joshua decide to do? Joshua decided to obey carefully. Joshua turns around and tells everybody the exact same instructions he received. And he's very careful to get all the details right. The narrator is careful too. Notice in verse 15, on the 7th day they rose early, at the dawn of the day, and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. It's super clear. Joshua is following all the instructions down to a T. And by the way, these aren't easy instructions. The whole army would have gotten ready to go out and march around Jericho each day. If you didn't know, it takes a lot to prepare for a combat patrol. First, the leaders have to get together and discuss the mission details and come up with the scheme of maneuver. Then the leaders break and they go out to meet with their senior soldiers to hash out the details for their specific portion of the plan. Then everybody goes to get their gear together, body armor and helmet and everything else you think you're going to need. The ammo has to be gathered and distributed and the extra magazines loaded up. You've got to get the radio frequencies set. The GPSs have to be synced and you have to make sure the counter IED pack is ready. Then the leader brings the platoon back in and gives the detailed mission brief. Next is rehearsals and pre-combat inspections and final weapon and gear adjustments. And then you have to sit and wait in 100-degree heat for everybody else to get ready while you debate if you have just enough time to run to the bathroom real quick. Here's a picture of me after a patrol when I was deployed to Afghanistan. I assume because my helmet is cocked back that this must be just after getting back to base. I promise you, before the Israelites even stepped off for the first time, they were sweaty and grumbly and tired. Joshua knew what he was asking of his people was not, pardon the play on words, just a walk in the park. It was a significant undertaking, and it was done very carefully. And amongst that careful preparation and execution was extreme patience. Think about it. Jericho was right there for the taking. These warriors were already tested, having defeated King Sihon and King Og east of the Jordan River. They've tasted victory and probably presume that more stands just in front of them. But first, they must be patient for 7 days while they march around the city. Now, Jericho was probably about 10 acres in size, so the daily march around the perimeter of the city would have taken about an hour. And that doesn't include the preparation time that I just mentioned or the distance they walked back and forth between their camp and Jericho. That means every day the entire nation prepared to marched to Jericho from camp, marched around Jericho, and then marched back to camp, and then probably collapsed from exhaustion in front of their tents. And they did this every single day for 7 days. And then just imagine the seventh day. It would have taken them close to 7 hours to march around the city. How exhausted and irritated they must have felt. How tempted they must have been to just rush the walls and claim the victory that was surely theirs. And yet, in all of this, Joshua decided to obey patiently. Even the way the story is written draws out the suspense. In verses 8 through 14, the pace of the story is significantly slowed. There is much repetition and what seems like needless details to our Western ears, but all these words slow the narrative down and build the suspense. Imagine you're just a young kid listening to her grandpa recount this story. You're waiting on the edge of your seat as he drones on. Oh, and then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priest took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on, and they blew the trumpets continually. And the armed men were walking before them, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned into camp. Come on, Grandpa, get to the good part. We know what's coming. Get to the battle, right? But I think the narrator purposefully uses his storytelling to give us an insight into the massive amounts of patience that Joshua and the Israelites had to demonstrate while obeying God. Okay, we're almost there. The battle is finally about to begin. So let's pick up reading in verse 16. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent." Pause. Don't forget, God had previously told Moses and Joshua and the Israelites to completely destroy the Canaanites. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, God says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show them no mercy." And in Deuteronomy chapter 20, later he says, "But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. But you shall devote them to complete destruction as the Lord your God has commanded." So now we hear this. Joshua appropriately altered God's instructions by honoring the spy's oath. Remember, back in Joshua chapter 2, the men that Joshua sent in ahead to spy out Jericho were almost captured. That is, until Rahab, the foreign prostitute, saved them by hiding them in her house and helping them escape. Afterwards, they set an oath, promising to save her and her family when the Israelite army returned to defeat Jericho. By the way, let's also give some mad props to Rahab here. She made a pretty courageous choice too. She put her life on the line for the sake of Israel, a foreign nation with a foreign God. And the reward for her declaration of faith and courageous action that day was to become the great-grandmother of King David. That means this foreign prostitute is a direct ancestor of Jesus. God can redeem and use anybody. And all of this was only because Joshua decided to obey compassionately. Now, let me be clear here. Joshua was not disobedient. Otherwise, I doubt Rahab would have found herself in Jesus' lineage. There are many clear imperatives in Scripture where there is no wiggle room, and we need to follow instructions exactly. But sometimes there's a spectrum of obedience. Sometimes different actions can each still honor God. And in this moment, when there was a spectrum of obedience, Joshua decided to err on the side of compassion. He could have claimed God's earlier words and still killed Rahab and her family, but instead he made the difficult choice to be compassionate in his obedience. Now, finally, victory is at hand in verse 20. So the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. So this verse describes the actual capture of the city. It's quick and it's brief. And honestly, it seems a bit anticlimactic, right? All of that buildup, all of that story, all of that careful, patient, compassionate effort, and it seems that the walls just fall and the city is captured kind of easily. Again, I think that's on purpose. The emphasis of the entire story is on Joshua and the Israelites' obedience to instructions rather than the military action itself. Now, some scholars have tried to argue that God could have used an earthquake or some man-made or natural event, but the text doesn't give us any information around how exactly this happened. All it tells us is that the Israelites obeyed patiently, they obeyed carefully, and they obeyed compassionately. And then the walls fell. Church, this is my big idea. Obeying God is hard, but worth it. Obeying God carefully is hard. Obeying God patiently is hard. And knowing when and how to obey God compassionately is hard. But if obeying God is worth it, we have to find a way to do it. So how are we to obey carefully, patiently, and compassionately, even when it's hard? Luckily, I think the author of Hebrews provides us with the answer. Read with me here, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 30 through 31. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Now, the Greek word piste is what's called an instrumental dative, which means it should be translated by means of faith. So it's through faith we're able to obey God even when it's hard. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the greatest theologian of the 20th century in my opinion, has much to say about the relationship between faith and obedience in his book, The Cost of Discipleship. In it he says, only he who has faith is obedient, and only he who is obedient has faith. For faith is only real when there is obedience, never without it. And faith only becomes faith in the act of obedience. Faith and obedience are a package deal, something that Joshua demonstrated and the book of Hebrews validates. By the way, this obedience that we're called to doesn't come from some God who sits on his high horse and gives us a do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. It comes from a God who has perfectly done everything that he's called us to. Jesus is the perfect example of obedience. Jesus obeyed carefully, dying on the cross when he didn't even want to. He said, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Jesus also obeyed patiently. Each gospel gives an account of Jesus' long journey to Jerusalem and his eventual death. He knew exactly what he was moving and traveling towards, and yet he obeyed patiently, waiting for the timing to be just right. Finally, Jesus obeyed compassionately. On the cross, he pleaded, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He was talking about his own murderers. Even in his obedient death, he was compassionate. And that compassion extends to each one of us, because on his shoulders was laid the sin of you and the sin of me. He paid the penalty of our sin. He did what's required for true justice, and he made straight the path towards a reconciled relationship with God. Jesus is the perfect example of careful, patient, compassionate obedience. That's why obedience, it's not just for the sake of following rules. It's to honor and glorify a personal, loving God who wants nothing but the best for you. And he knows exactly what's best because he uniquely and purposefully created you. True obedience, accomplished through faith, honors and glorifies God. And know that when you inevitably mess up, as we all do, you will always receive unending mercy and grace because of Jesus. Let me say that again. When you inevitably mess up, you will always receive unending mercy and grace because of Jesus. Church, would you agree that we often can't control the outcome of specific situations or even our entire lives? But we can control our actions and our obedience. Not that our actions or obedience guarantees any specific outcome, especially not salvation. That comes only from the work of Jesus and nothing of our own doing. But we can control our response to God's call for obedience through faith. It's by faith that we can obey God even when it's hard. By faith, we can obey God by being patient and supportive spouses, even if our marriage is in trouble or ends in divorce. By faith, we can raise our children to be sensible and love Jesus, even if they wander far from responsibility or from God. By faith, we can give of our financial resources and our time, even if we never see material prosperity or the fruits of our labor. No matter the outcome, in all of these circumstances or more, we can confidently say, obeying God is hard, but worth it. Even if we have to wait until the other side of eternity to appreciate it fully. So, church, I want to invite you to evaluate yourself with me right now. Where does your obedience fall short? I want to call out 5 different groups here, and depending on which group you identify with, hopefully that'll help dictate what I think your next step is. For some, if I'm being honest, you simply need to start obeying God. I bet that as I've been speaking today, there might be something that has just popped into your mind already. A step of obedience that you know God is calling you to, but you don't want to do it. It might be something small and seemingly insignificant, or it could be something big. Your next step is to make the choice to obey. For others, you already obey, but you need to start obeying carefully. You know God's word, and you know what He's calling you to. You just need to follow through on it. We aren't called to obey halfway or obey until it's uncomfortable, but rather to surrender our will completely to Him. It's time to do it God's way, all the way. So I would say your next step is to make the choice to carefully obey. For yet another group, it's time to obey patiently. You know what needs to be done because you're already doing it, and you're doing it carefully, but you're forcing it. Just as important as doing it God's way is doing it in God's timing. I remember Pastor Derek saying something that absolutely wrecked me last year. The right thing at the wrong time is the wrong thing. Your next step today is to make the choice to patiently obey. For some, this one right here might actually be the hardest step of all. Some of you are obeying carefully and patiently, but you're not obeying compassionately. Jesus' harshest words were reserved for the Pharisees and the religious experts. Their sin wasn't primarily a careless or impatient obedience, but rather an obedience that completely lacked compassion. If your heart is judgmental or prideful, if your behavior is arrogant or discouraging, then your obedience is worthless and you're imitating the Pharisees. You need to make the hard choice to obey compassionately. Finally, some of you just need to be encouraged. Obeying God is difficult. You know that. It sucks sometimes. It's okay to say it. It's okay to feel dejected, helpless, or abandoned at times. You're not crazy. Or, you and I are the crazy ones, and I guess at least that makes 2 of us, right? Be encouraged. Obeying God is worth it. Even if our perspective can't see it now, have faith that your obedience will be rewarded in eternity more than you can ever imagine. No matter what aspect of obedience is a struggle for you right now, I want to encourage you to acknowledge your shortcomings before God today. Don't pretend you don't sense that prompting or try to hide your feelings about it. Talk to him about it. He knows you know. Then tell someone. Talk to a close friend, a spouse, or your life group. Talk with someone about how you feel you might be called in this moment to start or better obeying God, and how that is going to be hard. It's okay to admit it. It's just not an excuse for inaction. Once you've identified it and you've talked about it, it's time to go do it. And let us in the church come alongside and encourage you, because it's absolutely worth it. Church, when boiled down, faithful obedience is trusting that what God has commanded us is for our good, and then doing it His way. It's trusting that the means which God has laid out in front of us and the future that He has prepared for us are both better than what we could ever attain or accomplish on our own. Obeying God is hard, but worth it.